got two conference lectures in this conference. That is lectures where we invite our principal speakers to... look, three, I'm sorry, look, three, well, four actually. I've got a programme I've organised myself. So Derek and Julia gave their introductory conference appearance, of course, on Wednesday evening, and now we have Julia's lecture today. Doris is speaking tomorrow afternoon, and Derek, of course, is rounding off the conference in an inimitable fashion on Sunday. Incidentally, I'm going to give you the first news that for those who are making their plans to leave, please take in mind that everyone who stays to the very last moment of the conference, it's fairly early, it's early in the afternoon of Sunday, will get a very special prize which could be worth quite a lot of money. It's certainly worth money, and it's up to you how much it's worth. And everyone will get one of those prizes, and no one's going to be told what it is until the end of the conference. I thought I'd mention that now because it might affect your decision as to what time you're going to leave on Sunday, and you may be making those arrangements or thinking about them now.
And stay if you've got Jupiter on your midheaven.
Yeah. Right. Now, so this is the second, and for Julia, I think her major contribution to the conference, I think it's something that she's researched very widely, very deeply, and so she's really got to offer it. So I hand you over to Julia Park.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I'm going to have to read this paper because it's too complicated to do it off the cuff, so I hope you won't be too bored. But I do feel in this way you can probably get more from it. And as I hope I've constructed it fairly carefully and sensibly, if I did it off the cuff, then I'm sure I'd miss out on things. So as much as both Derek and I hate reading lectures, I'm horribly afraid it's a must this time, so do bear with me anyway. And you've got the sort of funny ephemeris thing, I think most of you can see. I should be referring to some of these sign placings and aspects during the course of the lecture, and having them printed I think makes it a little bit clearer. The talk's also got very much a bias towards the arts and culture, simply because that's my scene. But the basic astrological principles, I suggest you think about them and apply them to your own individual interests outside astrology. I'm sure if you're interested in sports, you could apply them to sports and think of them in terms of sporting personalities, or whatever you do, you can stretch this particular theory. As I say, I've done it from an arts point of view because that's my kind of background. Anyways, I hope you won't be too bored, and let's see if we can get something out of it. Now, for at least 3,000 years, and probably much longer, the solar system seemed to man to be constant. Whatever mistakes he may have made about the way in which the visible heavenly bodies did or did not move around the Earth, at least it was obvious that there were 7 of them, including the sun and moon. But then, of course, in 1781, Uranus was discovered by Herschel, and in 1846, Leverrier and others located Neptune, and finally, in 1930, Pluto was discovered. The influence of the modern planets is in the main general and universal, but we must not forget that each of them can, for a variety of reasons, be powerfully personalized in the individual birth chart. Perhaps because the planet concerned was about to rise or culminate, or it's in conjunction with the sun or moon, or because it's the chart ruler or moon ruler. When there is this kind of emphasis in the chart, the planet in question works for an individual in 2 ways, overtly and psychologically. And it is very often the case that that person will identify very strongly with the causes, aims and fears of his or her own generation, even becoming a generation leader, a trailblazer, much concerned with the issues of the day. The most interesting of these generation influences is surely that of Neptune. Uranus is not so consistent or so poignant a marker, and neither is Pluto, though really important periods of change often occur when either Uranus or Pluto move from one sign into another, and they have a particular effect when they form aspects to each other or to Neptune, or sometimes to Jupiter and Saturn. This has been very powerfully shown over the years, and it is certainly likely to be seen again during the coming decades. It is possible to see very clearly the pattern of Neptune's influence over a whole generation, and that influence seems to work on two levels and in two very distinct ways. On one level, there is best what I can describe as a prevailing mood, affected by the influence of the planet as it travels through a sign, making its presence felt on emotions and opinions and events, political and cultural. On another level, we find that the generation of people born at a particular time will express their Neptunian attributes in their personal image and their identification with particular objectives in life as they grow to maturity. For instance, the influence of Neptune on world attitudes and events between 1901 and 1915, while it was travelling through Cancer, was different from the influence it exerted through the lives of people born between 1901 and 1915. And that came about later when they were more mature adults. The opening decade of the century seemed to many people to be wonderfully promising. The death of the aged Queen Victoria seemed the prelude to a happier, freer lifestyle under the influence of her far more liberal son, King Edward VII. On the harsher side of life, striving for better conditions with Cancerian tenacity seemed to be the lot of the poor. Even when the structure of life fell apart at the outbreak of the First World War, idealism, at least for a time, prevailed. Rupert Brooke was only one of a large number of young men who cried, "Now thanks to God who has matched us with this hour." And at least for a while, war seemed to be brave and fine and good. At home, the popular song which began, "We don't want to lose you, but we think you ought to go," summed up the mood, a period of Neptune deception behind which Cancerian family life was strained and often broken. We should not forget that those born during the early years of the century had Neptune in Cancer in their birth charts, and they were the hardest hit by the confusion at home with father away at the war. They saw it all as children, and then less than 30 years later they saw it again, this time as women having to cope with their children alone, or as men having to leave their families for army service. More Neptunian chaos and sadness. Until May 1914, Pluto was travelling through Gemini. Between then and 1938, it made its slow way through Cancer and occupied the early degrees of that sign as Neptune was travelling towards its end. The Plutonian violence of the early decades of the 20th century, and remember that at the time Pluto was undiscovered, made itself felt in its own way, and it should not be forgotten that it actually changed signs in that fateful year of 1914. Between 1905 and 1909, an opposition aspect between Uranus in Capricorn and Neptune in Cancer was operative. This exerted a very powerful generation influence, entirely reconcilable with the dreadful disruption caused not only in Europe by the First World War. In 1915, Neptune entered Leo and travelled on through that sign until 1929. During that time, Leonine creativity was emphasized in some very interesting ways. The three modern planets are only, of course, modern in the sense of having been relatively recently discovered. They've been part of the solar system since the beginning of time, and indeed it is fascinating to add their influence to those other planets as considered by the ancient astrologers who had no knowledge of them. and to see how their conclusions are illuminated and expanded by the new astrological influences. When Neptune was first sighted in 1846, many new movements and cults were the rage. Photography was making rapid strides. The romantic ballet was approaching its height in France, and many people were engaged in the study of psychic phenomena, and hypnotism fascinated others. The public was impressed by the new and extraordinary gas lighting, so it's not difficult to see that Neptunian and Piscean overtones in many of these things. It would be difficult to put up a scientific defense of the connection, but surely it is of interest. Similarly, with Neptune establishing itself in Leo, we find the cinema becoming a real art form, with the great films of D.W. Griffiths, Intolerance and Birth of a Nation, stunning their audiences, just as in another area, the Diaghilev Ballet was having the most enormous influence on the culture of the Western world, not only in dance, but in music, art, and fashion as well. The film and the ballet can be said to be areas which reflect the influence of Neptune in Leo, an influence which was profound and long-lasting. If one searches for an individual birth chart to express the full impact, image, and qualities of Neptune in Leo at its most potent and exaggerated form, one need look no further than that of Marilyn Monroe. Her chart has, of course, been discussed and examined a very great deal. I don't want to spend much time on it here, but I feel that had she been born a little later, after Neptune had crossed the horizon from the first and the very personal house to the 12th house, the psychologically orientated house, which has a special relationship with Neptune, then maybe she would have been able to have coped with the pressures in her life, and her life would have been greatly enhanced. Her whole story, I think, might have been very different. At the end of the 1920s, there was a change of astrological generation influence, together with a new astrological and astronomical development, and I think both are relevant and of interest. Pluto had entered Cancer in 1914 and was in that sign when it was first seen in 1930. It was not to move into Leo until 1938. As man first became aware of Pluto, the Wall Street crash was bewildering America and setting off a string of world economic crises. Astrologers strove to make the connection. They associated Pluto with business, with the surfacing of underground influences, with crime and gangsterism, and this, of course, was the period of prohibition in the States. And most importantly, with the deeper psychological levels of the human personality, and the recalling to the conscious mind of the deepest unconscious motivations. It was at this time that the study of psychoanalysis was developing in Europe, so no wonder Pluto became the accepted ruler of Scorpio. There's a story, you know, that Pluto received its name when an astronomer was asked a little girl what they should call him, and she was very fond of Walt Disney's dog character Pluto, so she said to the astronomer, "Oh, we'll call him Pluto." I'm not absolutely sure if this is true, and I've got a printed thing, a printed reference saying that certainly a small English child did name Pluto, but even if she did, it seems, you know, out of the mouths of babes and sucklings, you know, it's quite amusing. Anyway, whether it was Walt Disney or not, there we are. There's Pluto, king of the underworld, making his presence felt. It is interesting that we seem to see the forces of the underworld having their say at the time of upheaval when Pluto was first seen, and it is a fine coincidence that a small child should have named the planet after the god of the underworld. During 1929, Neptune settled down to a transit of Virgo. For some time, it was my view that the change of influence was not as strongly marked as in some other cases. But if we look at it closely, some interesting facts emerge. Virgo is a critical but communicative sign. It's also practical, hard-working, somewhat tense, not at all dramatic and showy, nor sympathetic to luxury or glamour as Leo is. Importantly, it's ruled by Mercury. Now, at the time when Neptune was transiting Virgo, what did man discover? The talking pictures. In 1929, the first full-length talkie was released, heralding the development of communication at a level more persuasive and popular than in the whole history of man. Watching a film, you were released from the necessity of working. You did not have to read long words or struggle with grammar. Sorry. Perhaps you did, I don't know. And you didn't even have to use your imagination. The communication was instant and signalled clearly by Neptune travelling through the Mercury-ruled sign Virgo. And only a few years later, in 1935, when Neptune was still in Virgo, came the establishment in Britain of the first regular public television service. As Neptune ended its transit through Leo, the collaboration between the very powerful creative and imaginary forces ended. The great Diaghilev died, the man whose powerful imagination had had such far-reaching effect in the arts. And it's very interesting that in 1930, one woman called Lillian Bayliss established a theatre company which was to develop in time into three: the Royal Opera, the Royal Ballet, and the National Theatre. And she was the antithesis of the flamboyant Diaghilev. She was a deeply religious, hard-working, practical woman, totally committed to bring art to the ordinary man in the street. She left her mark on the arts in her own way, and the comparison between her and Diaghilev is also the comparison between the effects of Neptune in Leo and Neptune in Virgo. As we say, Virgo is a practical sign, much attracted to simplicity, and this relates to lifestyle in every way. For instance, there's often a preoccupation with diet and health, the need to live a good, that is, healthy life. As we all know, many Virgoans are attracted to vegetarianism, to natural food and fringe medicine. All these things were popular in the 1930s. Many naturist resorts were established, and there was a craze for natural exercise, hiking and cycling, for instance, often encouraged because they were relatively cheap at a time when recession and mass unemployment was rampant. Something of a similar trend can be seen today, and no doubt encouraged perhaps by the young people or by the rather different influence of Uranus in Virgo. The influence of Neptune in Virgo on the generation born between 1929 and 1943, when it ended its transit of that sign, seems to have accentuated the critical element. In a generation which asked questions, and when it didn't get the answers it wanted, it came to its own conclusions. There were many who questioned the religious beliefs of their parents, refusing to accept blindly the attitudes passed down to them. There was much rethinking of traditional values and beliefs. But it was not a generation which sought to impose its own standards. In some ways it was even timid. One thinks of the bright, clean-living American boy or girl next door of the Hollywood films of the time. Completely inoffensive, not as rebellious as their parents, only beginning to strike out a new line of their own in the mid-50s with the advent of rock and roll. Society at the time seemed unremittingly nice, especially where the lower middle classes were concerned, and even the youngsters with money were less given to living wildly than those of a previous generation. The Second World War imposed a further constraint upon them, and the Virgo influence on this generation produced a certain demureness characteristic of the sign. Compare the young men and women of the late 1940s and early 50s with their parents at the same age, and the contrast is quite striking. Circular skirts, hair cut in ponytails, square dancing. These are mild substitutes, surely, for the girls of the wild 20s, their hair cropped and their skirts equally cropped and their bosoms flattened, dancing the Charleston and the Big Apple. 1943 saw Neptune settling down to a transit of Libra. By then, the war in Europe was beginning to sap most people's energies. When will it be over, was the common question, and people were beginning to put things off until after the war. There was a continual uncertainty, mirrored in so many of the popular songs of the period. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when. And it was during the same uncertain years, when there seemed to be no clear view of the future, that the generation was born which was to become that of the flower power, peace-loving people of the mid-60s. It is almost as though the longing for peace filtered into their blood from their mothers before they were born. But before I turn to the world's questionable future, let's continue for a moment to look at the recent past. Peace movements gradually developed through the 60s, but it was when the Neptune in Libra generation reached maturity that the powerful influence became most noticeable. Unfortunately, it also embraced escapism, often into drug taking. And again, the popular music of the time expressed the emotions. All you need is love, and all we are saying is give peace a chance. In the United States, draft cards were burned, to the disgust of the generals and commanders of the older generation, many of whom have Libra stressed in their birth charts. The influence of Neptune in Libra is a confused and a confusing one. The muddled thinking of the flower power generation, their romantic, often lackadaisical attitude, illustrates it perfectly. We've all worked on quite a lot of charts with people of that generation, all with a strong emphasis on Libra. Many of them talented, but many of them caught up in the drug scene, often ruining their lives as a result, and sadly making little of their excellent, highly creative and original potential. Yet the saga continues to be fascinating, for while the Neptune in Libra generation expressed itself in a cry for peace and love, the prevailing atmosphere was that of Neptune in Scorpio, into which sign the planet had moved. Neptune was sharpened, its influence intensified, more encouragement for indulgence in hard drugs. Another generation was being born, with the influence on it of the startling, almost terrifying conjunction of Uranus and Pluto in Virgo. Bring the influence of Neptune in Scorpio together with the heavy, grim energy source of Uranus and Pluto in Virgo, and the resulting generation has a startling potential. Remember, first of all, that of all 12 signs, Scorpio is the most energetic, emotionally the most highly charged. This is a vital point. The influence is not going to go away. In addition, both Uranus and Pluto relate to power. The children born between 1963 and the end of 1968 are totally different to their peace-loving parents. They have different needs and different priorities. Events such as the assassinations of President Kennedy and his brother and of Martin Luther King are just 3 examples of the misguided energy of Neptune transiting Scorpio, contrasted to the needs of the young men and women of the time for peace and love, the qualities of Neptune in Libra. Relating recent important inventions and developments to the astrological structure, it's impossible to ignore the importance of the computer. Many people still regard it with utmost suspicion, fearing that in some way it will take over. Others are properly apprehensive about its misguided use, or about the mistakes which can be made when it is improperly programmed. Like most technological developments, it crept up on us, but has proliferated in the microprocessor form since 1975. So, who will win this particular power game, the technicians or the machines? Will the impact of the computers begin to be felt under the Sagittarian generation influence of Neptune? Problems were being solved and the research consolidated in the atmosphere of Uranus and Pluto in Virgo, which, as you will know by now, realise I see as one of the most crucial planetary influences of the 20th century. From time to time, there are what I can only call traffic jams of planets in one sign or area of the zodiac. Now, the media always thoroughly enjoys this. They somehow get to know about it, and generally they believe that astrologers will be happy to predict that the end of the world will occur at 2:15 a.m. on the following Tuesday. All this, of course, is nonsense, but when it occurs, 2 things can be relied upon. For a few days, children are born with the qualities and characteristics, positive and negative, of one sign extremely powerfully emphasized. There could, as a result, be some imbalance in their personalities. They will be very Libra, very Sagittarian, and so on. Obviously, depth analysis of their individual charts will reveal a great deal more than something as bland as general as that statement. The other manifestation of a great many planets in one sign is a different kind of imbalance. When several planets are on one side of the zodiac, the whole solar system is, in a sense, out of balance, and under certain circumstances, at such times, the physical effect of their gravitational pull on the Earth seems to be manifested in freak weather, floods at Alice Springs in Australia, at a time when there would normally be drought, snow in California, sometimes earthquakes. Anyway, here's another area deserving quite a lot of serious study, I think. Anyone wondering about the personality of the generation born with Neptune in Scorpio and Uranus and Pluto in Virgo, that is between 1957 and 1971, needs only to look at some of the modern punk rock groups with their hard image, their leather clothes, often torn apparently as a result of violence, and their lean and hungry look, their inventive and imaginative makeup and hairstyles, and their apparently inflexibility, contemptuous attitude to their audience. The influence was a grim one, and they are now coming to maturity. But let's look at some interim influences. Pluto entered Libra in 1972 and ended its journey through that sign in August of 1984. And now, of course, we all know it's in the early degrees of Scorpio. Uranus entered Libra in 75 and remained there till 81. Supporting this, Saturn was in Libra between 1980 and 1983. At that time, Neptune was travelling through Sagittarius, having entered that sign in 1971. Uranus is in Sagittarius until 1988. And now, of course, Neptune's in Capricorn. So overall, the influence lies in two signs. Basically, we have Pluto in Libra and Neptune in Sagittarius, with other heavy planets supporting one or the other. The influence seems overall to be a philosophical one, but it is also somewhat lackadaisical. It tends to make for people who just sit around and think, maybe who won't want to take action unless they're absolutely forced to do so. It is not the sort of influence we would expect to see in an individual eager to get problems resolved once and for all, or in someone at all autocratic. Such a person would not be very good at actually getting down to business. Excellent, yes, at coming up with learned judgments about what could happen and what might happen, but not very good at taking practical steps to prevent disaster or finally resolve a major issue. If we think of Libra and Sag together, we think of a pleasantly relaxed atmosphere, of cloistered academics perhaps, or also of lively enthusiasm, of people prepared to take risks, but perhaps never actually getting round to things, as Libra will say, well, why bother anyway? All this can be related to the subtle influence of Libra and Sagittarius on a generation level, and surely one can see it clearly. Yes, there have been plenty of skirmishes in international affairs when one thinks of Afghanistan and the Falklands, Grenada, and certainly the problems in the Middle East. But thankfully, no major international confrontation has come about. And when one looks at the international discussions about the most vital considerations, what does one find? Yes, agreement that nuclear war would be mass suicide. Yes, that the oil resources will eventually run out, and we may indeed be poisoning the atmosphere, that a greenhouse effect might destroy the world's climate. But as to actually doing anything about it, well, there have been a few booklets suggesting that we should hide under the stairs when the nuclear bomb drops, or get into a brown paper bag, but not much else. However, almost uncannily, the prevailing mood does seem to be changing. From that easy combination of influences shared by Libra and Sag, we are moving towards those of Scorpio and Capricorn, from the air and fire towards the water and earth, to a totally different setup, a totally different emphasis, and a complete change of atmosphere. It seems to be the case, astrologically speaking, totally different setup, a totally different emphasis, and a complete change of atmosphere. It seems to be the case, astrologically speaking, that there will soon be an end to our sitting everlastingly around tables and endless discussions, to the issuing of meaningless communiques, the end of doubtful discussions. And the time for philosophy is over. Pussyfooting around the problems of the day will no longer be tolerable or tolerated. The time for action approaches, for really searching out the roots of our problems and attacking them. The earth element in Capricorn will permeate the atmosphere and will be a very powerful encourager to common sense. It may be that because of the practical nature of Capricorn, we will have to put up with discipline and we won't like it very much. I would relate the world recession of recent years to the transit of Pluto through Libra, with, for instance, the imbalance in the distribution of world wealth and food resources, which has provoked so much proper criticism and comment. Politically unpopular measures may be inevitable, not only on a national scale, but on a world scale, and perhaps these will be necessary sooner than we think. But though such measures may be hard, and there will certainly be much agonizing as the capitalist system of the Western world and the communist system of the Eastern world find some kind of accommodation one with the other, for this is surely inevitable if man is to survive at all, I believe that the earthy influence of Capricorn and the more drastic influence of Pluto in Scorpio will do much to ensure that they succeed. These two signs offer very contrasting influences, but in the end they are not uncomplementary. They represent a bringing into the open of things, and above all the energy sources of Scorpio and Pluto, together with the cooler practical elements of Capricorn, can come together and hopefully achieve some astonishing results. These two influences offer real hope. The pattern may not be an even one, and it rarely is, in the lives of any individual with Scorpio strongly emphasized in their birth chart. But it is an upward pattern, and if it moves unevenly and joggily, it does mount towards a goal. It is hoped that the jogs will not be sufficiently severe to spoil what is likely to be ambitious progress. The two influences I've been discussing may not seem much fun, and it is true that of all the signs, Neptune is at its least escapist in Capricorn. At least, this should mean that the idealism of the planet will be well controlled, and the aspiration of the sign, combined with that idealism, should result in excellent potential. Restriction and control, two qualities which spring to mind when we think of Capricorn, will be in the air. Scorpionic energy, as channeled through Pluto, will be present in quantity between now and 1995, asking to be tapped. But it must be remembered that the generation born during the 60s, with Uranus and Pluto in Virgo and Neptune in Scorpio, will produce people who will, during the next decades, attain a position of power and prominence. They will have enormous resources and will, most importantly, be thoroughly in tune with the tone of their time. I can't stress too strongly the fact that it will be within the power of this generation to overcome the most difficult of our problems, to use its energy and its determination, its inherent ability to detect, elaborate and accomplish what has to be done, and in a very positive and constructive manner. On the other hand, it is certainly the case that when all these qualities could, if misdirected, go seriously wrong, the energy could be used destructively, with one fanatic power finding expression in extremism and violence. As I see it, this generation needed a great deal of firm guidance from its parents during the crucial early years. It needed discipline and to be kept fully occupied, for if the energetic forces of these youngsters have at their disposal, if it stagnates, they can easily become discontented and restless, and will then express their energy negatively, as indeed we're finding with the football hooliganism. I'm sure that's all part of it. Hopefully, it will be those who psychological, emotional and physical resources positively for their own good and the good of the community who will assume the really powerful positions in our society. and the future of the world depends on this, on the emergence of the right members of a particularly dynamic generation. The coming decade may be crucial in the history of our planet, and with luck we will find ourselves facing a future which is at least likely to take place. The prevailing mood and atmosphere of the coming generation will influence the Scorpio-Capricorn generation, and it is an uneasy one. It will not suddenly manifest itself overnight, but neither will it be many years before we apprehend it. Neptune moved into Capricorn on January the 19th, 1984, and interestingly, Jupiter entered the same sign on the same day. On the previous day, children were born with an exact conjunction of Jupiter and Neptune in Sagittarius, while on the following day, babies had an identically the same conjunction in Capricorn. A fascinating area of research for anyone who wants to get busy in natural astrology, both from a personal and generation point of view. Do get some kids' charts and look at this. I think it's so interesting. Such a different area of power, isn't it? Moving, that terrific conjunction there, and then within a matter of minutes almost it was there. So it's a lovely thing to look at. Have a lot of fun with that. But to return for a moment to the generation with the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, I think it will emerge that those who become prominent in public life over the next 8 or 10 years will be those with either Virgo emphasized in their birth chart by sun, moon or rising sign, or those with the conjunction culminating. Those with Scorpio prominently accented will also emerge, probably as the transit of Pluto makes contact with the area of that sign emphasized by the sun, moon, ascendant or midheaven, or of course by the position of Neptune as it was in the sky at the moment of their birth. What other areas of life are likely to be accentuated during the Scorpio-Capricorn period? Well, it would seem that the ever-growing interest in ecology will continue. The problems of the dwindling Earth resources and the conservation of animal and bird life of the world's forests will be increasingly important issues, and the best side of Neptune should work through the Earth element to help these causes. It may indeed be the case that the balance has already been tipped and the ecologists are winning more battles than they actually realise. Scorpio and Pluto are much connected with oil and mining, but an alternative source of fuel to oil should certainly be fully developed. Perhaps one has already been recognised, or perhaps something new. Here is one thing on which our young Uranus-Pluto men and women can concentrate. There could be further work too on the exploitation of natural materials, the better and more economic use of wood and wool, for instance. There should be a keener awareness of the good things of the earth, of naturally grown fruit and vegetables, and such experiments as the over-treatment of farming land by artificial fertilizers and the consequent problems of overproduction may be recognized at last as a mistake. Necessity or common sense, or most likely a combination of both, should have good results. As the cinema was accentuated when Neptune was travelling through Leo, and television was developed while the planet was travelling through Virgo, so we might remember that Capricorn is a musical sign and often emphasises that art form. So maybe there will be new developments here, Capricorn being stark and down to earth. Perhaps a new musical dimension will reflect those qualities in some way, resulting in sounds as strange to us as the 12-tone scale was to the generation that was first shocked by it. The image of the Neptune and Capricorn generation at home could be somewhat earthy too, emphasising real fabrics, cotton, wool, hopefully not fur. It will be at all events very different from the image of the Neptune and Scorpio generation, and not as relaxed as that of the older Neptune and Libra one. The alternative would be an ultra-conventional look. We must remember that Capricorns are often very conservative in dress, so there could be a swing back to the conventional, to formality and a seriousness of image and outlook. If it's possible to assess a key period when the Neptune and Capricorn influence will make its mark around us, it will surely be at the time when Saturn is travelling through that sign. And this is between November 1988 and February 1991. Early in 1988, Uranus enters Capricorn and will remain in that sign until January 1996. So the emphasis at that time will be very strong indeed, and it is not difficult to see how it will build. The starkness of Saturn plus the humanitarian influence of Uranus could work well, again, provided the energies are positively directed. In the late 80s, between March and June of 1989, Saturn, Uranus and Neptune are all going to meet within 8 degrees of each other in Capricorn. In the following year, they will all fall between degree 9 and degree 29 of the same sign. This will certainly lay a very heavy Capricornian influence on anyone born when that sign is rising or when the moon is placed in it. During the first period, the inferior planets will be at the other side of the solar system. So from a geological point of view, there will be little risk of earthquakes or that kind of natural disaster. But on individuals, the influence will be strong. In the following year, there will be a more complex influence with greater imbalance. For during that period, the Sun, Mercury and Venus will also transit Capricorn. This is a time to study if your particular interest is geological or climatic astrology. A conjunction of Uranus and Neptune is strong enough to command our attention, for it can only occur once in 171 years. The coming conjunction will first be in orb during December of 1988. It becomes exact on February the 2nd, 1993, and they will still be close when Uranus enters Aquarius in 1996. Here is another interesting generation influence. It offers inspiration, humanitarianism, and a tremendous regard and concern for the future, and a desire to make a better life for mankind. And of course, the Aquarian influence from Uranus occurs at the same time, and it will strengthen it. The conjunction is dynamic, but gentle and inspired, and if those concerned do not allow themselves to be carried too far away from reality in their idealism, for the influence can be over-romantic, they should do excellent work. The state of the solar system during the middle and late 1990s is astrologically fascinating. Neptune first enters Aquarius in January 1998 and settles down to a transit of that sign in 1999. By then, Uranus is already well established in Aquarius. Pluto ends its journey through Scorpio in November 1995 and enters Sagittarius. So the prevailing atmosphere then will be Sagittarian and Aquarian. Greater freedom for the individual, greater independence for all men, an all-round influence on humanitarianism, direct links with as yet unknown solar systems. I wonder. The first decades of the coming century seem to promise much, if we can survive the heavy interim influences of the Uranus, Pluto, Neptune and Scorpio generation. But what of the generation born with Pluto in Libra and Neptune and Uranus in Sagittarius? Neptune in Sagittarius is at its most philosophical and in many ways at its best. It can cope with challenging situations and wants to be in the van, to lead, to inspire others. Here are children with a hint of Sagittarian joviality, and certainly almost all the children I know at the moment who are coming along with Neptune and Sagittarius have a delicious sense of humour, and I can see all the mums here who've got children with Neptune and Sagittarius grinning. They're absolute honeys. They've really got just this lovely little sense of humour. Lovely. Yet again, they are as different as chalk and cheese from the Neptune and Scorpio lot. By the time Neptune in Aquarius and Pluto in Sagittarius period arrives, it is these children who will be running the world. I like this combination of influences. It is a positive, hopeful and wise one. Those under its sway will not be slow to take advantage of the prevailing influence of Neptune in Aquarius. So, I end on a question. Will the new age of Aquarius at last make its presence positively felt at that time? Will our lovely planet come of age achieve at last a little international wisdom and good sense? Will it be capable of properly analysing its enormous problems and be beginning to solve them? I think we must all look to the all-powerful Virgo-Scorpio generation for the answer. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. If people want to ask questions, then feel free to do so.
I've noticed the conjunction of Uranus and Neptune and Capricorn will be trining Virgo, Uranus Pluto generation.
They'll get the transit, will they, when they...
Yes, almost pretty well exact from Uranus, Neptune and Capricorn to the Uranus Pluto conjunction Virgo. Pluto in between the two and Scorpio.
Well, this is something...
1990.
That would be quite interesting to do some work on, wouldn't it? Because it's quite strong. Yes, that's worth following up.
With Capricorn.
Yes.
Got the Pluto in Uranus conjunction with Virgo.
Well, that could be quite a key period too. Obviously, there's a lot more than the ones I picked out because you would go on forever, you know. But I do think all these big generation aspects are fascinating because the influence does will out when you look at them in retrospect. Yes, sir.
The people with the Uranus Pluto Jupiter conjunction in Virgo, when they've got that angular, technical genius there for solving the problems coming up now, to be very smart.
Well, let's hope they use it that way. Anyone who's got a client with that, we must encourage them.
I have a son.
I had a child with the Uranus Pluto in Virgo,
Yeah.
and I find the friendships being more and more emphasised. I mean, these children growing up with friendships is so much more than perhaps in early years it was more the one-to-one relationships, and there's friendships more important than the romantic aspect.
Well, that's a positive culture.
The group thing's very important.
Yes.
My lot with that.
I think the group thing is, well, it's tribal, isn't it? You know, it goes back thousands of years, and it seems to occur all along the line in some way or another, wanting to be like the crowd.
Very cleansing way, I think.
Is it good? Yes, it's good. It's a tremendously strong influence, I think. Yes.
Don't you think that Uranus Neptune trine that in Uranus Pluto, because we really all go to the occupied with it because so many of us have children.
Yeah, I know you're going to all have to watch out for them.
That violence that you were talking about before, which I think is so strong and prevalent, either emotionally or physically, in that generation of kids. When they're the ones that are going to be in their mid-30s at that time.
Absolutely.
They are going to be the bosses.
Yes, this is what
I think that Uranus Neptune trine back is going to be in many ways the turning point for many of them to express that huge energy, which I think is only violent because there's nowhere
because there's nowhere for it to go. Oh, absolutely.
So
sure. They haven't been able to find the right outlets.
Yeah.
At least the ones that do, of course, are doing marvellous things.
Yeah.
I was saying to someone the other day, we hear all about the horrible things because that's news. We don't hear about the lovely kids who get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and practice their violins until 8 o'clock until they go to school, We don't hear about all the kids who spend all their time working out on their sport interests. That's good news, you see. It's just the nasties that make the headlines.
And there are more of those.
Yes,
I think it's rather interesting how that group of short cycles with the parents who were probably the most responsible.
Yes, I know. Yes, they needed actually Victorian fathers to guide them, but there were these nice, kind, gentle people with these sort of hotbeds of energy. Yes.
They have Victorian fathers that all gone out and made another empire. Washed on the rest of the people.
A lot of the Uranus Pluto got trying to be influenced.
Yes, yes, yes. But then, you could go on like that forever, couldn't you? I mean, if you start, you can't split it down into, you've just got to take a very broad picture of it. And of course, some of them will have lovely trines from the sun and moon and Mercury, and they can use it, it can be personalised in every conceivable way. But I'm just thinking of it as a mere block generation influence at this level. And as a starting point of thinking about it when you have to interpret it in the individual chart, and then say how is that individual coping with the influence, and then look at whatever trines, sextiles, or whatever it's got to counter it.
It's just another idea of this generation of stuff that's growing popular. I did some work once on Uranus particularly the squares, the Uranus squares to its position. So if you take, for example, quite nice example, the Uranus in Gemini, a large of the people who related a lot of computer technology.
Yes.
Uranus in Virgo generation, which could be their children.
Yes, of course it could. Yes.
Are the ones who have to play with video machines.
Yes, exactly. Yes, right.
And where are we? And then you think of Uranus in Cancer, cloud power people, and they produce these Uranus in Libra children who somehow then have this job of trying to hold the planet together through this crucial time that lies ahead of them.
Yes, quite.
And quite often while looking through the whole thing, you can see
a pattern, can't you? Yes, you really can. Yes. But I can't urge you too strongly to follow your own trails with this, because it's jolly interesting. And as I say, whatever your own interests are, apply them to the influences, and you'll find all sorts of interesting things emerge. It's great fun and very worthwhile. Thank you.
Towards others is usually based on fear. And it's very often something that when we come to like ourselves, in fact always as we come to like ourselves, then there's no need to be hostile. We'll have discernment, we'll have feelings, we'll be deeply and beautifully alive every moment and every day. We'll recognize the cycles of life, the so-called high days and the low days, and we'll love ourselves whether it's a high or a low day. And recognize the seasons that are within each of us. We all go through the spring and the summer and the autumn and the winter of our being, and all are as beautiful as all others. We go through the daylight and the darkness, and all are perfect in their expression. And we appreciate now our mind and our brain. And we recognize that our minds are able to flow to wherever we project those minds. We have the right to ask questions of ourselves and deeply know that we can have answers. And the answers can come in many different forms. And the important thing is to move away from conditioned expectations of where answers come from, of where our riches come from, where our needs are going to come from, where the love offered to us comes from. Just relax and know that it's necessary to be who we are and allow the beautiful universe of which we are part to supply those needs. There is no need to have fear, and the greatest fear we so often experience is the fear of fear. So we relax and move beyond those illusions and move into that point within ourselves. We move into the love aspect we move into the joy, we move into a deep state of faith, a deep state of just being who we are. And now we're going to see around you a beautiful passive scene. A scene from nature, somewhere that you feel comfortable with, somewhere that you would just so enjoy being. And when you visualize it, then you're there. Now you're there, visualizing this passive scene. There you are, as part of that passive scene. All of you now beautifully relaxed and in just enjoying being there. Just enjoying being who you are. Because you really are very beautiful, very worthy, extraordinarily unlimited. You're a being with just so much potential. You're a being who need never be lost for what to do next. You're a being who can bring great healing to yourself, to others, and to this whole planet. And moving into your most exciting part of your life, because you have now experiences that no money could ever have bought. You have experiences which have brought you wisdom and understanding, a new point of searching and seeking. Now you're sitting there quietly on the chair in that passive scene, that scene from nature, and coming across towards you is a person who you feel that you want to forgive. It's a person that you want to have peace with from here on. I want you to imagine yourself getting up and walking across to meet that person. And as you do so, you will have different feelings inside you, different experiences. I want you to imagine meeting that person and just taking their hand and just saying to them, I really appreciate your being. I really appreciate the fact that we can now work through the divisions and the separateness, and that we can both move through this as greatly enriched people. Now take that other being back to the chair which is just opposite yours and sit knee to knee, hands to hand. And it's a good thing to probably just start off by telling that other person some of the things that you've been through. Maybe some of your hate thoughts, maybe the fact you've perhaps feared, things that have been bottled up inside and you've told many other people, but you probably never told them. Just see yourself talking to them now, sharing with them what you share with other people, but not them. They will understand at this level. And now I want you to say to that person, please forgive me for all I've done to bring this about. Please forgive me for my part. Please forgive me because we both decided on this together, and I know it's probably been painful for you as it's been painful for me. So I'd ask you first of all to forgive me. And then I want you to tell that other person a number of things that you've always admired about them. Tell them some of the nice things that you've seen about them that you probably haven't managed to tell them before. or even if you have tried, they'd never seem to hear you.